Karen, for such a kind and generous introduction. And I am thrilled to be in Penrith on Budget Week. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Darug, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, emerging, as well as to any Indigenous person who is here today. You are quite right to say that we are on the grounds of the Penrith Panthers, and I do want to take this opportunity to thank the Panthers for the contribution that you are making to the rebuilding of the West Tigers. And I mean, you breed them, we steal them, right? I'm thrilled that you are going to make sure that we contribute and win the premiership eventually with your players. So thank you very much for that. And equally, it is so nice to see what we will soon describe as the old Penrith Stadium. And for me personally, it is always nice to see a project in real life and not as a line item on a spreadsheet as well. And you are quite right to say that Stuart yourself have secured $309 million for this redevelopment. And I thought that whilst I was here, I would also undertake a stationary audit to make sure no one's wasting any of that money as well. But I am looking forward to seeing how the stadium looks and how it gets rebuilt, because it is such an important part of the civic infrastructure here in Penrith. I want to just acknowledge all the civic leaders who are here, the Mayor of Penrith, the councillors of Penrith City Council. I know Julia Griffiths is here from Blacktown Council too. It's good to see you. I also want to acknowledge the former member for Penrith, Stuart Ayres, and congratulate you on your new role. It's always excellent to see former politicians gainfully employed. Gives me hope for the future as well. And with that, I also need to acknowledge the presence of the former Treasurer of New South Wales, the Honourable Peter Collins, a very, very fine public servant as well. It's good to see you. I do make one thing that when I became Treasurer, I came to understand very quickly is that we all answer to a higher power, and particularly when it comes to investment in Penrith. And as it turns out, that higher power is Karen McEwen. And Karen and the team have been a relentless sort of advocates for this community. And I'm really pleased that in this particular budget, we were able to find an additional $1 billion for the Mamre Road Stage 2 project for construction between Erskine Parks and Kemps Creek, continuing on in a bipartisan way. The work that's been undertaken to make sure that Western Sydney is getting the road connectivity it needs to connect people to jobs, to be able to make sure that this growing population is getting the infrastructure share that it deserves. And alongside the Deputy Premier, who's also the Minister for Western Sydney, we have been able to put this money aside in this budget. We've also been able to find $800 million for Elizabeth Drive, jointly funded with the Commonwealth, and $60 million for the Western Sydney Freight Line connection to begin the planning work on that vital piece of rail infrastructure to make sure that we are able to use rail to move freight, back the investment that's been made by ACFS and others at that wonderful industrial park, the jobs of the future being built here in Penrith, supported by this budget, acknowledging that we have a lot more work to do to make sure that we translate the promise into reality, but we are starting. And I make that point quite deliberately in saying that we well and truly recognise that the population gravity has been in Western Sydney for a very long time. I myself am from Merrylands. I don't claim Penrith status because, I'm from Merrylands and we're better. But I well and truly acknowledge the fact that this is where the nation's future is. I often say that if you want to see what Australia's economy will look like in 20 years, come to Western Sydney today, come to Penrith, come to Parramatta, come to the Macarthur region, come to what is Southwest Sydney, because this is where that future is being built right now. And I want to speak about two things, particularly in this particular address, about the challenges that we face and the actions we have to take to deliver that change and to realise that promise. The first is to recognise that right now we have a lot of families and a lot of businesses doing it tough. We are amidst the worst cost of living crisis in more than a generation. We do have inflation very high. We do need to get inflation out of the economy, and we also need to make sure that we begin to rebuild the purchasing power of the families that have sacrificed so much to be able to reduce inflation and to slay the inflation dragon. And that was at the back of my mind throughout the entire budget process, with a very difficult budget challenge and a very difficult budget time. But the conclusion that certainly the government took, which we're happy to contest with you if you disagree, but there's no point us engaging in putting the state into further debt, racking up further interest bills, if all that would happen is that the money we would spend would see the RBA keep interest rates higher for longer or put them up again. And that's a hard call. Interest rates have worked to slow the nation's economy down, as they were intended to do, all these hikes. But we have to recognise that it's had an effect on the nation, but it has a particular effect on New South Wales and a particular effect on Sydney because our land values are higher and people's mortgages are higher. So when you have 13 interest rate increases in the spans of roughly 15 months, the sharpest rise in interest rates that's taken place in the wake of a global pandemic and some geopolitical shocks as well, we have to recognise that that is cause people to stop spending, and therefore we want the people to have the right to spend their family budgets, which means I have to be very careful with the states. That is the reasons why, in the context of this budget, our broader economic strategy for the short term has been to make sure that we are doing our bare bit to take inflation out of the economy. That means being very careful and disciplined about new spending, and that means being really tough on proposals to expand unless there's a clear social economic benefit to that spending. So it's in this budget, like so many businesses in this room who've had to make very difficult decisions about what you can afford to invest in and what can you afford to fund today and what needs to wait. We have adopted an approach that says that we will invest in the must-haves, the Mamre Road projects, the Kemps Creeks projects, the connectivity on Elizabeth Drive. We must have those projects to build the future for this region. But there are a lot of nice-to-haves that have had to wait. It's fair to say that Accor Stadium is not getting a new roof. Penrith Stadium is getting an upgrade, but Accor Stadium is not getting a new roof. That's a good example of one of the tough calls we've had to make, which means that in this particular budget, the state's expenses growth is at about 1.7%. We did find $13 billion worth of savings last September in my first budget, and that has meant that we don't have to make any sharp shocks, given that the state's also just lost a big whack of GST funding. 1.7% expense growth, as Peter would tell you, is pretty hard to deliver. And it does require us focusing on the fundamentals about what's going well and what's not going well, making tough calls about what's worked, what's not worked, finding ways to move that resources away from things that haven't worked towards things that will work or can work better. And that is no different to what every business has to do in tough economic times. So if it's right for the businesses of Penrith, if it's right for the businesses of Western Sydney to do, it's right for the government to do as well. Equally, we've taken a real focus on making sure that we are stabilising the state's debt as well. When I became the treasurer, shadow treasurer, which was back in June 2021, the day I became shadow treasurer, New South Wales was borrowing its money, its 3-year money, at 0.43%. The day I gave my first budget, we were borrowing our money at 4.98%. That's a tenfold increase in the cost of our debt. And that means you have to ask yourself, are we getting 10 times the return for the borrowing? And if we're not, then you've got to be careful and very disciplined about what gets funded and what doesn't get funded. So in last year's budget, we did make some pretty tough calls about the type of projects that didn't really stack up. Some of them were quite controversial, particularly in the north of the state. Some of them are controversial, particularly in the central west of the state, and I acknowledge that. But that is the reason why we made that call. It's very different when you're having to make an investment decision when the cost of your money is 0.43 versus the cost of your money being 4.98%. And so we had to make those calls. But that is also the reason why we're in a position today to be able to say that despite the Commonwealth Grants Commission taking $11.9 billion off New South Wales, we're not going to seek to hit families or businesses to make up the gap. we have stabilised the state's balance sheet to the point where debt by June 2026 is $9.6 billion lower than what we inherited from our predecessors at the same point in time, after making the investments we're making in transport infrastructure, after we're making absorbing the impact of the state losing $11.9 billion in GST. We've been able to pull that off. That means interest expense growth, which was growing at about 23% a year, it has now dropped to about 7% as we refinance our emergency debt that the previous government was right to borrow during COVID, but does now need to be refinanced at the back of the decade, bringing that expenses down, making sure that we're not going out to the market and borrowing more than we need to, which is why I'm actually quite pleased, for the nerds amongst you, that the bond market has already reduced our spreads in the last 3 days and has rewarded New South Wales for being one of the few states in the Commonwealth this budget to say to the market that we'll be borrowing less money than we previously told you. Progress. But ultimately, we make these decisions in the short term to make the right investments in the long term. And that brings us to one of the principal challenges that we're facing as a state, which is the challenge of ensuring that we can house our population and that the next generation of people here in Penrith, in Western Sydney and across the state have as much a right to own a home, rent a home, live in a home as their parents and their grandparents did. My parents came to Marylands, actually. Well, they came to Australia from India in the 1970s. My mum and my dad, their very first place that they stayed was in Potts Point in the 1970s. And they looked around Potts Point in the 1970s and they went, this place has no future. So they moved to Granville. And my father passed away when I was 5. My mother was an accounts clerk working at the Boral Quarry, actually over on the M4, just off the off-floor near Greystanes. On an accounts clerk's salary, was able to raise 3 kids, excellent public schools, Westmead Hospital nearby, access to a free GP, a union job as well, is the reason why. But she was able to manage that setback, but also because she could afford a house. On a widow's wage, she was in a position to be able to afford a house in Marylands, and that meant that we had stability, and that meant that we were able to participate in schooling, and it was a point where I got the opportunity, therefore, to go to university. That is, I don't think the next generation should be locked out of that same safety net of a secure house. And that's why this government has done a lot in the last 15 months to be able to show people that we can keep what we love about our neighbourhoods, but at the same time make sure that there are more people in them and that our kids and our grandkids can afford to stay and live in this city. We are borrowing billions to build some amazing world-class public transport. It's only right and fair that our kids and our grandkids have the right to live near it. And they are the changes that we've been inaugurating since we came into office. And I've got to say, in this particular budget, we've complemented the work we're doing to speed up a planning system that, yes, as my good friends from Legacy Property tell me, we've got a lot of work to do on that front, but we are speeding that up. But in this budget, we have made the biggest investment in social and affordable housing that any New South Wales government has done ever. And $5.1 billion extra to support 8,400 new social and affordable homes, with half of them for the victim survivors of family violence. In addition to that, here in Penrith, as there is everywhere else in Western Sydney, $1 billion to upgrade the existing housing stock that we have, 33,500 homes set to get an upgrade. Important work in the middle of a housing crisis, not glamorous. So, as David pointed out yesterday in the MacArthur, arguably not a vote winner, but the right thing to do in the midst of a housing crisis, showing that our strategy is comprehensive, spanning the private sector, spanning our key workers, spanning social housing intervention and making sure that people who need to escape family violence have somewhere safe to go. We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot more work to do. We've got a lot more work to do to make sure that the $1 billion that's going to Nepean Hospital translates, again, promise to reality in terms of the services that are being delivered. The 100 public preschools, 49 of which are being built in Western Sydney, that they get operating and they get running as well. That we do continue to build the roads and the public transport that we need here in the future. That Penrith Stadium's upgrade continues apace. Each budget we make progress. No one budget do we solve every problem, but in each budget we make progress. And in Budget 2 we've made progress. I'm glad to have had the honour to present it. I look forward to seeing how the community reacts to it. If you don't like this budget, rest assured I'm starting work on Budget 3 in a month's time. Thank you very much.